My name is Max. I come from beautiful Vienna, Austria, which actually is like around the corner from here. So what you see in the background there, that's Vienna. You can follow me on Twitter if you have any questions, comments, or feedback after the talk. Just ping me on Twitter and I'll answer them whenever. I work as an open source developer at ThinkMill. ThinkMill, we're a full-stack JavaScript agency from Australia. Now, before you get confused here, I am from Austria, all right? Austria and Australia are two separate countries. They are not the same thing, okay? If you come to me and ask me about kangaroos, I'm gonna punch you in the face. So I work for ThinkMill, which is an agency based in Sydney. We do lots of Node.js on the back end and tons of React and React Native on the front end and on mobile. As an open source developer, I maintain quite a few open source projects, some of which you might have heard of. The most famous one is React Boilerplate, which just 2 days ago crossed the 10,000 star mark on GitHub. It's one of the most popular React starter kits currently on GitHub. I also maintain Keystone.js, which is our Node.js content management system, and Elemental UI, which is our React component library that we built to build the Keystone web interface. Now, before that question comes up in the Q&A, I have stickers, okay? If you want stickers, come find me afterwards and you can have some, all right? Yeah, thank you. See that? Yeah. We are now, for the past few years, have been in what I like to call the component age, right? We have this emergence of a new pattern of building complex user interfaces, right? The web and CSS and everything was sort of inherently made for documents, right? It was meant for scientific papers to be exchanged, which isn't like the perfect model to build user interfaces in, right? So we discovered that we can build components, and then we can compose these components together and can build really complex user interfaces much more easily. You can see this in not only in the popularity of React and frameworks like Ember and Angular 2, but also in the emergence of things like BEM and Suite CSS and style guides being a thing and pattern libraries. All of these things just point towards everybody loves components, right? As we've started building these component-based systems, we've discovered some best practices when working with them to make our lives easier. The first best practice that I think everybody agrees on is that you want to have focused components, right? Small focused components that do one thing and do it really well. Like a button component, for example. That's just a button. The button component isn't a header, a footer, a sidebar, a main area, and a button. It's just a button. And no matter where you put it, it's still just a button, right? That's really, really nice to work with as a developer because you just build those tiny Lego blocks, like it was said yesterday in a lightning talk, and then you just put them together and they're all going to be perfectly fine. Now, because we have these completely focused and small components, we want them to be independent as well, right? If I change something on the button, either the styling or the behavior, I don't want that to affect anything else, right? Just because I set the background color of my button to red instead of green doesn't mean that the header is now two screens wide instead of one screen wide, right? Doesn't make any sense. Components should be completely small, focused, independent, and do their own thing, and do it really, really well, right? And then the last pattern that we've sort of discovered is that it's really good to split smart and dumb components, or stateful and stateless components, or containers and components, whatever you want to call them, right? Smart components are components that care about how things work, right? So you have some smart components that sort of handle data, right? They get some data, or maybe they even fetch some data, and then they format it and render some other components based on that. But they don't actually have any styling or anything. They just care about formatting data and then rendering some other components. Dumb components or stateless components are components that just care about styling, right? They don't care about any data. You just pass in some text and it works perfectly fine. Why is that a nice pattern to work with? Well, the thing is, now your backend developer can come to you and can say, hey, so we needed to rework the entire API because we realized that we could do the caching so much better. And you're like, okay, and then you just fetch the new data, go into your into your smart components, just change the formatting slightly, but if you still render the same components out, everything's going to work perfectly fine, and everything's going to look perfectly fine as well. On the other hand, if your designer comes to you and says, hey, We just reskinned the entire interface. Everything looks entirely different now. It's still the exact same behavior, but we now have red instead of green as a background. You're like, well, okay, I just go into my components, edit the styling a little bit. You don't need to worry about any data fetching, any data management, nothing. You just go and change the styling of your components. And since you render out the same components anyway, the behavior is going to stay the exact same. It's just going to look slightly different. So this is really nice for code reuse in your code base, right? And you can sort of take these small components, compose them together. It's really, really maintainable because you can build these tiny components really, really well. You can spend a lot of time making them as good as they can be and work in all of these contexts that you need. And then you just put them wherever and they work perfectly fine. So what about styling, right? As we started building these complex user interfaces with components, we sort of noticed that CSS wasn't quite made for components, right? It was made for documents. So we've also discovered some best practices around styling, right? The first of which is that every class you have should only be used once. Now this might sound a bit weird, right? But if you have a button class that you assign on the button component, right? If you change the styles inside that button class, that should only affect the button and nothing else, right? That ties into the other thing from before. You want every class to just affect that one component and nothing else, right? That allows us to use components as a styling construct instead of CSS, right? We can take advantage of the full power of JavaScript and of React to style our user interfaces. Michael Chan, at Chantastic on Twitter, wrote a great article about this topic called Style Components. And he has this quote in there where he says, if you're writing React, you have access to a more powerful styling construct than CSS class names. You have components. And I think that's very much the crux of inline styles. That's why we want to put our styles in our JavaScript files, right? That's why we have this power. We have JavaScript to style our really complex user applications. But we're stuck with trying to somehow integrate logic into a language that wasn't made for it, right? It doesn't work very well. Instead, let's leverage these components that we have, compose them together to build really big, complex user interfaces. I just talked about all of these best practices that we've sort of discovered as a collective for building component-based systems. Now, the thing is, best practices are very good and fine, right? But how do you enforce best practices, right? Best practices that aren't enforced don't really help you much, because while you might follow them, some people in your team might be a bit lazy and suddenly, they build a big smart component that has some styling, and suddenly you don't really know what's going on and you have weird bugs in your code. Now, code reviews sort of help with that, right? You can do really extensive code reviews, really make sure your code base stays, clean and sane. But the problem is, humans make errors, right? I make errors all the time. It just happens, right? Every bug you've ever had, the chances that that was there because a human made it, pretty high, right? That's just the thing that happens. So instead of relying on humans to do all of this stuff for us, right? Instead of relying on humans to follow all of these best practices, why don't we enforce them? What do I mean by that? How can you enforce these best practices? Well, as it turns out, the styling library is a great way to do that. And that might sound a bit bonkers, but that's kind of the basic idea of why we made style components. It's a styling library we released recently. We being Glen Maddern and I. Glen is from Australia. I met him when I was down there on a holiday. And I'd been thinking about this CSS thing, this styling thing, for a long, long time, right? Because Nick Graff, who is also in the audience somewhere, is a good friend of mine who also lives in Vienna. He made Bell, a very famous third-party component library. I make Elemental UI. I've built tons of React apps that all needed some sort of styling. And there was no solution that sort of satisfied all the needs, right? Because while we had some good solutions for apps, right? We had some good solutions for building applications in React. We didn't really have any good solution for building themable third-party component libraries, right? It was really hard. We tried to mangle things together. Every component library was slightly different. Everybody had their own ideas. We tried tons of stuff for Elemental UI, right? We tried all the different libraries you can think of. Everything was sort of a bit painful, and we wanted to change that. So what we did is we removed the mapping between styles and components. What does that mean? Remove the mapping between styles and components. Well, if you think about any styling method you've ever used, right? In CSS, for example, you have class names. So you have a styling fragment, some code that styles something, then you have a class name. And you take that class name and you assign it to a DOM node, right? You say something like div class name equals class name. That's a mapping. If you use inline styles, you have some sort of variable, right? You say div class name equals styles dot whatever, right? There's always this mapping going on between styles and components. What if we just remove that mapping, right? Because we want to have single-use classes anyway, and we want to have small, focused components. So why do we have that mapping? We don't want to reuse the styles anyway. So let's get rid of it. What does that look like? Well, it looks like this. Now, before you call me crazy, all right, let's talk about this. The first thing we do here is we import style from styled components. Nothing fancy going on. And then we say this const title, notice the uppercase T up there, equals styled.h1. Styled.h1, we call that function, and when we call it with our styles, what happens is that it returns a React component that renders an h1 tag into the HTML. So this title variable up there is now a React component that you can use in your JSX just like any other React component, right? So after this style.h1 function call, we do this weird backtick thing, right? And pass in some styles. Now this weird backtick thing is an ES6 feature, right? That was recently added to the language by the new ECMAScript standard. It's called a tagged template literal. Now I'm sure you've heard of template literals, right? Just calling strings with backticks. But now you can also call functions with backticks, which looks like that. Now this isn't some sort of custom feature we've added with some weird Babel transform, it's just JavaScript, right? I didn't know that feature. When Glen showed me his first idea, I was like, what is that? That looks so weird. But actually, it's really, really nice to work with, and it enables us to have some great features, which I'll get to very soon. Now the other part is we just have a wrapper component which renders an HTML section. We also pass some styles in there, right? And those styles will be applied to the React component. Now we take that title and the wrapper, and we render them in our JSX like any other React component. We wrap our title in our wrapper and say, hello world, this is my first styled component. Well, if you look at this in a browser, it's a wrapper with a background color and a title which is centered on the page and has a red color, right? The styles are just applied, and we've used it like any other React component. Now, something you might have noticed that's slightly different to any other CSS and JS library is that you write actual CSS when you make styled components. Why is that important? Well, as it turns out, CSS is very powerful for styling things, right? It was made for styling. Some people seem to kind of have missed the point of that because they try to mangle CSS syntax into JavaScript object, and it just doesn't work, right? You have to remember to quote everything, you have to remember to do double quotes in content, the media queries are really hard, like everything is just a pain. We have a language made for styling, let's use it. So styled components, since it's just CSS, right? We can do everything with those components. So in this case, I'm creating a color changer component which has a background color of papaya whip normally, and every H2 in that component will have a color of pale violet red, right? It's just CSS with some nesting. And then we have a media query. Well, guess what? Since it's just CSS, media queries are a thing, right? We don't need to use any JavaScript to change the styles of our components. We can just use media queries. Well, and if we're over a width of 875 pixels, the background of our box will turn to medium sea green, and the color of the H2 to papaya whip instead. What does that look like in a browser? Well, you know, it's a box. And when you start resizing it, what happens is it turns sea green. And then when you resize it back to small, it turns papaya whip again, right? It's just media queries. It's nothing fancy. It's just CSS. Now, in React, we have this thing called props, right? And sometimes you want to adapt components based on props. So for example, imagine you have a button component, right? And you want to have a primary button component, right? You want to be able to say button primary, and that should look more important, right? It should look bigger or more important or full of color, right? How do you do this with a styled component? Where do properties even go? Well, what you can do here is you can pass as a function as an interpolation. And into that function, we will pass in the properties that are passed to the components. Meaning you can react to the properties that are passed into the component and change the styling based on them. So in this example here, what happens is that we have a background, And if props are primary set to true, the background will be pale violet red. If props are primary set to white, if props are primary set to white, props are primary set to false, the background will be white. And the color is the exact other way around. If props are primary set, it's white. If it's not set, it's pale violet red. Now again, we use this like any other React component, right? We say button, pass in some text. Or we say button primary and pass in some text. And what does that look like in the browser? Well, it just looks like two buttons. One of them is normal and one of them is primary, right? Nothing fancy. Now, because we realized that we kind of both needed styling third-party component libraries, right? We've been building them for a long time. They're very useful, but it's sort of hard to style them. So styled components has theming built into the system, right? You no longer have to use some weird other way of styling your third-party components. You just style them like any other component, right, in your entire app. All is just the same. What does that look like? Well, we export this theme provider component that you can import in your code. And you can set some theme, and you can do whatever you want in there, right? In this case, we just set the primary color to pale violet red. And then we just wrap some part of our app in the theme provider, passing in the theme. And now our components can react to the theme. How? We inject the theme from the props. So if you pass a function, you can go props.theme, and you have access to the entire theme. So the button can now react to the theme and change its colors, its styling, based on what the theme is somewhere high up in your code. But you don't have to pass in any properties or anything. It just reacts to it, right? So you can have two different themes. If we have a red theme and a blue theme, because we have different sections of our site, all we have to do is we have to wrap them in a theme provider. And buttons inside the red theme provider will be red. And buttons inside the blue theme provider will be blue. Well, who would have guessed? This works as many levels down as you want. These are really simple examples, right? But it works really, really deep trees down, right? It doesn't matter how many React components are in between your theme provider and your component will always get the theme. So now you can build your component libraries with styled components, and you can build your apps with styled components, right? You can build your web apps with styled components. But you might also want to build an app, an actual React Native app for your, for your product. So styled components has full React Native support as well. The only difference is that you import styled from styled-components/native, right? And then you get access to the React Native primitives. So you can't say style.div, but you just say style.view, which is the React Native equivalent of a div, kind of, right? And you just pass in some styles. So in this case, we say the background should be papaya whip, and it should align and justify all its items in the center. And then below that, we have a title, which is just style.text, right? Another React Native primitive for text, who would have guessed? And you pass in some styles, making it big, setting the colors to pale violet red, and making it bold. And then you just render them like any other React component, right? We've seen this already. It's just React. And then, well, guess what? It just works. This is what it looks like. This is an actual screenshot from my phone. When we first built this, and I tried it, I was like, holy cow, this actually works? I was pretty surprised. Now, what we do here with styled components is we kind of put CSS in strings in JavaScript, right? There's two big things you lose when you do that. One of them is syntax highlighting, right? If it's a string in JavaScript, how should Atom know that it's syntax highlighting? Well, because I built it. It's actually built into Atom. If you use language Babel, styled components will be correctly syntax highlighted already. We've added support for Sublime Text. The PR will be merged sometime within the next 2 days and released. And we're going to add support for WebStorm and all the other IDEs next. So syntax highlighting is taken care of. But what about linting? Well, I just spent the past 2 weeks working on a styled components integration for StyleLint. So as of today, you can actually run StyleLint on styled component CSS. So what we see here is some really borked CSS, totally wrong indentation, spaces where they shouldn't be, and you just run StyleLint on your JS files. And styling correctly sees the CSS, says, hey, you messed up. You can fix your CSS, you can go in and fix the indentation, fix all the empty spaces, just make your CSS look good, run StyleLint again, it's not going to complain anymore, right? So suddenly you have linting and you have syntax highlighting, and what else do you need from CSS? Not much, right? Because you have JavaScript now. If you say, well, what about mixins? Well, you have JavaScript. Just make a mixin, just make it a variable. Everything else just works. Now, that's all very nice and all, right? But can you actually use this right now? Well, as you might have guessed, you can just run npm install styled components and use this right now. Or actually, wait, that's not a thing anymore, right? It's yarn adds styled components. I'm sorry. Yarn adds styled components, and you can use this right now. We're also on GitHub, so if you go to github.com/styled-components/styled-components, you will see the full source, you will see everything, give us a star, try it out, submit issues, submit pull requests, let us know what you like and what you dislike. ReactiveConf, thank you very much. Enjoy the remaining day of the conference.
Great, thank you very much. Let's look at the questions.
Slido. If somebody's asked if there's stickers, right, I'm going to punch you in the face. I have stickers. Oh no, actually, see, it's not even stickers. Is it possible to avoid too deep hierarchy of components in big applications? In this case, it's very hard to follow the data flow through components. So the thing is, right, you might think, well, with styled components, you sort of have all of these tiny components that just do one thing, right? That's a lot of components. But in reality, it's not different from what you're doing already, except of just writing div class name equals, like, what a header, you just write header. And it's the exact same thing, right? There's no data flow that needs to be sort of seen through styled components. It's all just the same as it was before, right? Because you take those small components and you compose them together into bigger ones, right? And it's just, if you use Redux, for example, it's really easy to follow, right? There's no difference to any other method of styling. What are best practices for passing global styles to components? That's an interesting question. When I talk to people about CSS in JS, and this isn't necessarily related to styled components, right? When I talk to people about CSS in JS, the question I get asked most often is, but what about global styles? Take a moment and think about what global styles you have in your application. The best use case is probably something like a reset, right? You probably use something like reset.css or normalize.css or sanitize, some sort of CSS reset to normalize cross-browser styling, right? You can still have them. I mean, styled components is not like, no, you cannot use resets. No, you just use a reset, right? Just drop it into HTML. Now, the other global styles you may say you have is something like global typography, right? I've heard from a lot of people that they say, well, okay, that's nice and all, you know, inline styles, it sounds like a great idea, but what about global typography? Instead of having global typography, have components, right? That's the whole point. You don't want to have any global styles, right? Just have components. Use components to your advantage. Build a heading component, build a paragraph component, build those components and compose them together. So no matter where in the app you look, everything looks the same, right? That being said, I realize that some people do need global styles sometimes. So styled components has an inject global helper that you can just import and inject global CSS into the DOM. Works perfectly fine. How do you handle pseudo elements in inline styles? So that's a question that's very good. Styled components is not inline styles, right? We inject actual CSS into the DOM. So all your pseudo selectors, all your pseudo elements, they work because it's just CSS, right? You can just say and hover or and checked or and anything, right? It's not inline styles, it's actual CSS, right? That's why you can write media queries and nesting and everything. It's CSS, not some weird thing that pretends to be CSS. It's just CSS, right? That's it. That's the whole point. How are vendor prefixes handled? We auto-prefix all of your stuff. You don't need to worry about it. I guess that's a good answer. If you want to know how it works under the hood, just go to the repo and take a look at it. What about performance and DOM size? How does it compare to actual CSS? I don't quite get the second part of the question, but I'll answer the first one. So, the thing about styled components is that for every component you create, for every small component you create, you kind of wrap another component around it, right? It's like a higher order component. And at first I thought, you know, I'm not sure if this is a good approach, right? I didn't actually kind of want to have wrapper components in my styling library. I just wanted to have components. But as it turns out, it doesn't make any difference anyway, right? I have 2 applications in production now, and Glen has built, I think, 1 or 2, I don't know. And about a dozen people also have come up to me in the last week and said, hey, Max, great work on styled components. We've switched everything over to it. I'm like, okay. But nobody's run into any performance issues. And in fact, we have a PR open that will make performance better like 10x, which is, you know, 10x isn't very much because we're already really fast. And then being 10 times faster isn't very useful. But it's going to be released probably today when I merge the PR, so it's going to be even faster. How does it compare to actual CSS? It is actual CSS, so it doesn't compare. It's the same thing except co-located and isolated. IntelliJ highlighting, yeah, we're going to add that eventually. I don't know how IntelliJ syntax highlighting works. If somebody here has done this before, please come to me and talk to me, because it's really hard. It's actually like adding syntax highlighting was probably one of the hardest parts of building style components, because it's a pain in the ass. Sorry, it's a pain, right? It's really, really, really tedious to do. I didn't do it because I couldn't get it done, right? It would have taken me 2 weeks to do it for Atom, but thankfully the Atom language Bible maintainer was like, yeah, sure, that sounds like a good idea, I'll just add it. And now somebody else has submitted a PR for Sublime, and now we have that TM language code. If we can just use that in IntelliJ, that's perfect, right? We can use it in WebStorm, we just need to figure out how to actually do it, which I'm going to do next week. So yeah, working on that. Are you writing tests for your CSS now? That's a very good question, actually. I am not, in the sense that I test what components look like in unit tests. What I do is visual regression tests, right? And I don't think CSS is necessarily something you can unit test. It's something we want to try to make work. We're not sure if we're going to get it done, right? We're not sure if that's a thing you can actually do, but we want to try doing it. But other than that, just use visual regression tests, and it's just the same as any other CSS, right? It's not different. Does it work with server-side rendering? Yes, it works with server-side rendering. The one tiny caveat at the moment is that there's no way to extract the styles, so you cannot kind of extract a separate style sheet, which is probably this week or next week, I will start building probably a Babel transform that takes all of your CSS and puts it into a separate style sheet. So this works right now, but it's going to get much better very, very, very soon. Are you sure this new syntax has real advantages against usual components with style prop inside? The thing about the style prop, right? If you use the style prop, it's inline styles, right? That means you don't have any hover, you don't have any check selectors, you don't have any media queries, you don't have any nesting, you have nothing, right? All you have is simple properties. You cannot actually style your application like that. Well, I mean, you can, but it's really, really tedious. We have a language that's made for styling. Let's use it, right? What is the best practice to support theming in an app using styled components? That is actually a very, very interesting question. Because we're still discovering best practices around that thing, right? We've built this theme provider, and there's currently a huge discussion going on. So if you're into theming, go to the styled components repo, look at the PRs. There's a PR called RFC theming, I think, where we're sort of discussing, we have global theming, but you kind of want to have component level theming as well. And it's a really weird concept. I, to be honest, haven't wrapped my head around that yet. Glen is sort of like, we need this in styled components. So I'm going to take a look at it. I don't really know what happens, so if you're interested in theming, just go look at that PR in the styled components repo. Why does the implementation return a component and not higher order component? Why is it not a higher order component? Well, it actually is a higher order component. The reason we didn't make it a higher order component in the React Redux sense, where you wrap your component in just a function, is, no, actually, you can do that, sorry. Yeah, you can actually do that. So you can call styled as a function and just pass in your component. And what happens is, styled components will inject your CSS fragment. Well, sorry, I should say you can call styled like a normal function. So you go styled, parentheses, my component, parentheses close, and then you go with the backticks and you pass in some styles. And what styled components will do is it will take that CSS, inject it into the DOM, and then pass your class name into your component that you can then assign onto your DOM nodes for it to work if you have a more complex component, right? So that totally works too. So that, yes, that works. This question, the next question, can you style/decorate custom components directly, e.g. styled my component? Yes, that totally works. That's actually the exact API. This is what it looks like. What about using any preprocessors? That's an interesting question. Who in here would like to use a CSS preprocessor with styled components? Who in here is thinking, well, what about Sass? Like 3 people? That's good. That's good. So I kind of put the point across. The thing is, you don't need a CSS preprocessor because you have JavaScript, right? You can just interpolate variables. In fact, you can have logic. Contrary to things like Sass or less, you can have actual logic. You can have really complex queries that work, right? You can, in your JavaScript, say, hey, if the browser has that user agent string and the device is smaller than that, and my user has a slow connection, show these styles. If that's not the case, show some other styles, right? Things that are impossible in any preprocessor, right? It's JavaScript. right? It's JavaScript. Let's take advantage of JavaScript instead of trying to mangle logic into a language that wasn't made for it. All right, that's my time. Thank you very much.